And so Spengler then comes to a point where he says that with the rise of these high civilizations, we begin to get the phenomenon of the alienated individual, or the individual who begins to separate himself from the mass. And this is the creative individual, the Buddha, the Gilgamesh, the Plato, the individual that establishes himself in contradistinction to the mass. And then he says that one of the problems of high civilization is that it creates an interdependence of all these individuals on each other and upon the society of which they are a part, to such a degree that the civilization that has been created as a microcosm now becomes a prison, and the individual is in a state of, it's basically fallen and caught and captured and trapped. So that the technological project, which the human species had started as a project of creating culture in opposition to nature, which achieves its antithesis with the creation of the city, begins to alienate him to such a degree that now he begins to become the slave of his own creation. And so we can begin to see the seeds of what's going to happen here with the creation of Faustian civilization, where he comes along and he says now that Faustian civilization differs from all of these other civilizations insofar as that the machine is its primary fascination, and it suffers from this tragic conflict that he says its intellectual comprehensiveness is at odds with a profound spiritual disharmony that's intrinsic to the culture. And he says that it is largely the creation of these 12th and 13th century Gothic monks, these individuals like Botelho and Petrus Peregrinus, Roger Bacon, Nicolas Dorine, these individuals who were all monks and who were fascinated with the properties of light and magnetism. They created lenses and windmills and mechanical clocks, all these first machines right around the year 1300. And they did it as a way of miniaturizing the idea of the universe as a cosmic machine designed by God. So they were miniaturizing their own machines that would obey them just the way that the cosmos obeys God. And so the primary myth that that has embodied Faustian civilization all along has been the desire to attain the unattainable and unachievable goal of perpetual motion. All of these machines all along have been carefully designed and redesigned and made more and more efficient so that they can approximate the unattainable goal of perpetual motion, a self-moving microcosm that propels itself out of its own inertia forever, which is of course impossible, but it is the myth of the machine that has been motivating us all along. It's basically Newton's first law of motion, which he describes as the law of inertia, where a body will continue in a rectilinear line on a smooth plane. If you remove all friction and air resistance on that plane, the body will continue in its state of motion forever. Basically, it will never stop. That's a variation of this myth of perpetual motion that has motivated us, beginning with these Gothic monks. And then he says that this is motivated out of a kind of will to power. He calls these men Vikings of the mind. And they're motivated by this will to power, this will to conquer nature. And he says that Faustian civilization differs from all these other civilizations, which in that the other civilizations have plundered the materials of nature. Faustian civilization plunders nature for her motive forces. To take the actual forces that move everything and build them into the culture has been the basic aim, the telos of Faustian civilization all along. And so now he says it's reached this level of complexity and development that has become so complex that it is now overstraining the Earth's resources. It is deforesting huge swaths of the planet. It is wiping out species, and it has extinguished entire communities, such as the Native Americans and the Australian Aborigines. And so he says now there's this dangerous overtension of the machine and the planet. And he begins to paint an apocalyptic picture here as we near the end of the book. And he's one of the first people, I think, to see this and to step up and say that Western technology, contrary to the myth of progress, is something that is finite. And it's just as finite as the technologies of all the other civilizations. It's not something that's going to go on forever. It will achieve its end. And its end is built into the fact of its overstraining of the planet's resources. This will bring it down. He also says that one of the other corrosive forces is the fact that through the colonialization process, the machine, Western technology, was distributed to other cultures throughout the planet, what he called non-white cultures. And as in the case of the Japanese during the Meiji Restoration, where they took over the machine and within a mere few decades mastered the creation of factories and the industrial process, and then use that knowledge to go to war against Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. All these other cultures now have the secrets of Faustian technology, but for them it's not a spiritual inward necessity the way it was for the West. They just use it as tools, and they may use it to dismantle the West, to undo the West, and they may actually do a better job of it. So this is an early example of the phenomenon of blowback that he sees as one of the main possibilities for what may undo Western technology. So he sees this blowback phenomenon on the one hand and the overstraining of the Earth's resources on the other as the main factors that will, one or the other, probably as the result of both, do Western technology in. And so he paints this wonderful, I want to read this last paragraph where he says, this machine Technics will end with the Faustian civilization and one day will lie in fragments forgotten. Our railways and steamships as dead as the Roman roads and the Chinese wall, our giant cities and skyscrapers in ruins like old Memphis and Babylon. The history of this Technics is fast drawing to its inevitable close. It will be eaten up from within, like the grand forms of any and every culture. When and in what fashion, we know not. So that's the second to last paragraph of the book, where he paints this bleak view of what's coming up ahead. And indeed, I think that Spengler was one of the first people to perceive the basic incompatibility of Faustian technology with the biosphere, even though he doesn't put it in those terms. It's basically what he's saying. And that I think now we're beginning to see with global warming and with what climate scientists are now beginning to say is that global warming is something real. It's a fact. It's not some scheme dreamed up by liberals as a means of taking money away from the right. It's nothing like that. It's a real phenomenon. It really is happening, and it's coming about, and it may be the thing that does Western civilization in once and for all. The CO2 that all these machines have put into the air, and interestingly enough, like Peter Sloterdijk said, he's a modern theoretician who's alive now, he says in his book Spheres that one of the interesting things about the West is that the entire history of Western civilization, the cosmology has been about these spheres, with the Earth in the center, surrounded and encompassed by these moving spheres of the planets that have surrounded it. But he says that with the rise of the Copernican cosmology, where the Earth was put into orbit around the sun, and the spheres disintegrated, leaving man ontologically naked in front of these infinite spaces. As Laplace puts it, the silence of these infinite spaces is terrifying. And so it puts man in an ontological status where he is naked and exposed. But then he says that what we proceeded to do with our technology was to create an artificial sphere through the greenhouse effect, through pumping all this CO2 and methane and all this stuff into the air. That's the byproduct of industrial outgassing. The poisoning and pollution of the atmosphere has replaced that philosophical sphere with a technologized sphere. We're surrounded now in a greenhouse sphere that has enclosed and encased us. But now the problems with this greenhouse sphere is, of course, the melting of the polar ice caps and the rising of the sea levels that it will inevitably bring about. And as our climate scientists are saying nowadays, CO2 has reached something like 393 parts per million in the atmosphere, which is where it's at now, and which is the highest it's been in 650,000 years. It hasn't been that high in that long a period of time. And that very soon it seems to be rising at about 2 parts per million every year, and by 2050 it's going to be probably it's going to be close to 400 parts per million. By 2100 it'll definitely have reached 500 parts per million. But the thing is about that is that the global mean temperature has already risen by 0.8 of a degree, so nearly a full degree, and our climate scientists are saying that even if we stopped all of our CO2 outgassing tomorrow, let's say, and it all stopped, the phenomenon of global warming would still continue because of the inertia that has already been put into effect in the atmosphere, and we would be locked in for a guaranteed 0.6 of a further degree temperature rise, which would put us at 1.4 degree no matter what. So it is going to go up to 1.4 of a degree, about 1.5 degrees, no matter what we do at this point. And we certainly aren't going to unplug all the machines anytime soon, so we can fairly bet that the temperature is going to keep rising. Once it gets, though, to about 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees actually, which it may do close to the year 2100, all the Greenland ice is going to melt. And with the melting of the Greenland ice, the sea levels will rise by about 7 meters. And which is a lot. And the sea levels are going to rise with that by about 20 feet at least. And a 15 to 20 foot sea level rise means that all of our coastal cities are they're just going to be uninhabitable. It's not going to be possible to inhabit them. It will be possible for a while for those economies to spend money on the creation of seawalls and dams and dikes, like the Dutch have done, and the British have built a series of a seawall, basically a giant sea gate. But that's only going to slow the process down for a while. Like Toynbee says in a study of history where he talks about the external proletariat, the barbarians, time is always on the side of the barbarians. They amass at the limes, the frontier of the civilization, and they just mount up, and eventually over time they're going to overrun that frontier. Well, I think nowadays that the environmental forces that industrial technology has unleashed against it are playing the same role that was played in the past by the external proletariat, by the barbarians. We don't really have an effective barbarian force unless you want to hold up the Islamic fundamentalists in that role, but I don't think they're quite enough to say that they pose a dismantling threat to the West. I don't see them doing that. But the environment certainly can and will, and it may play the role of the external proletariat that finally, as the sea levels rise and spill over the dikes and dams over these walls, we're going to start seeing these coastal cities being flooded. And the first thing that gets flooded are the airports, the airports in the local outlying regions. Then the city centers get flooded, then the suburbs. And all these cities like New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco and the Bay Area and islands that are sinking in the Pacific, they will all gradually be underwater. I don't think there's any force in the world that can stop that process. So we are beginning to see that Western civilization's future is limited. We will begin to see, as James Lovelock has written in his Gaia books, the desertification of the Midwest. The entire Midwest was once, the areas of Nebraska and Iowa, was once a Sahara-like desert not so long ago. And so it could easily revert back to this. And indeed, our farmers out there are saying they've never seen it so dry. And it could be the case that the entire Midwest will become desertified. We've been locked into a drought now from California to Florida for a number of years. This could be the signification of the beginnings of what will become the desertification of the Midwest, which will then become virtually uninhabitable. And the breadbasket will have to ship north to Canada. Most of the populations are going to have to move away from the coast and up into the northern regions anyway, and no matter what the scenario plays out to be. And the desertification also of Spain and France and most of Europe. And England's going to be some prime real estate, and so will Greenland. And this may end up moving civilization up to create a new sort of Arctic Rim civilization around the Arctic Circle, which is going to be valuable real estate. But so it looks like Spengler was right. The Western technological civilization, its days are numbered. And I think he was right. He was one of the first people back in 1931 to see this, long before the environmental movement got moving with Rachel Carson in the early 60s. And so that's basically what I wanted to accomplish in this talk, was this discussion of the prophetic nature of Spengler's book on Man and Technics, which I think is worth a read. You can read it. It's only 100 pages, and you can read it in a couple of hours. I read it just this morning over coffee, and it's worth doing.